Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive. Today, we're taking a bit of a shortcut, really, to getting up to speed on something that might genuinely shift how you think about early religious history. We're looking at Patricia Crone's work, specifically on Jewish Christianity and the Qur'an. And our mission, if you like, for this deep dive is to explore this really compelling idea that early followers of Jesus, specifically groups often called Jewish Christians, had a much bigger influence on how the Qur'an was formed than most people assume. It sort of pushes back against the idea that only, mainstream Christianity left its mark.
It's really fascinating how the source material lets us, well, connect some dots here. You see these surprising parallels between very early Christian beliefs, some that got pushed to the margins, really, and core ideas right there in the Quran. It's about looking at the foundations of these huge traditions with maybe fresh eyes.
Exactly. So get ready for maybe a few aha moments as we explore these unexpected connections. Let's dig in.
Okay, so before we get to the Quran itself, let's make sure we're clear. What exactly is Jewish Christianity, as the source defines it? It's not just any early Christian who happened to be Jewish, is it?
No, that's a really important point to make right away. Jewish Christianity refers to those early followers of Jesus who firmly believed that their devotion to him was, well, completely consistent with God's original covenant with Israel. They didn't see Jesus replacing God's promise to the Jews with one just for Gentiles. And a crucial part of this was holding on to their Jewish identity, continuing to observe the law. Some saw Jesus as a prophet, others maybe as a heavenly power, but keeping the Jewish law was absolutely central.
Right, and this is where they really differed from someone like Paul, who argued Gentiles didn't need the law. It sounds like there was a pretty significant theological clash happening very early on. Oh, absolutely, a major struggle. I mean, while all the very first Christians were Jewish, not all fit this Jewish Christian description we're talking about.
Yeah.
The big question was, did Gentile believers need to fully convert to Judaism and keep the law? Paul said no. But the Jerusalem church leaders, well, they insisted that Jewish Christians must keep practicing it.
And these groups, the ones holding on to the law, they eventually got marginalized, didn't they? Pushed aside. Our source mentions these later Christian writers, the patristic authors, in the 3rd and 4th centuries, labeling them things like Ebionites, Nestorians, 𝗔𝙘⁺. Are these like distinct sects, or is it more of a general term?
Well, the source clarifies they weren't always these neat little boxes, these distinct sects. It was more like a diverse range of groups who shared that core belief. Christianity doesn't cancel out Judaism. The Ebionites, though, they are a really key example. They get mentioned a lot as representing this marginalized stream of early Christian thinking. Definitely a group to keep in mind.
Okay, the Ebionites. And where did these Ebionites and other Jewish Christians end up? Especially after, the expulsion from Jerusalem around 135 CE?
They tended to concentrate in places like Aleppo, up in northern Syria, the Decapolis region around Pella and near the Dead Sea. And here's a really critical point from the source. Despite some claims they just disappeared by the 5th century, the evidence suggests these Jewish Christians likely survived, but outside the main Byzantine borders. You find traces of them in the Sasanian Empire, maybe Ethiopia, and importantly for us, in Arabia. And the source says they certainly reappear after the Arab conquests.
Wow, okay, so they were potentially still around.
Their survival and presence in those areas is absolutely key if we're talking about potential influence on the Quran.
Right. So, okay, we understand who these Jewish Christians were, these Ebionites and others. How does the argument for their influence on the Quran actually stack up?
Well, like I said, it's not a brand new idea. People like L.A. Springer were talking about this way back in 1861. But Crone really builds a strong case. She identifies several doctrines in the Quran that are just very, very hard to explain without bringing Jewish Christians like the Ebionites into the picture.
Are there significant counter-arguments, though? I mean, surely not everyone agrees.
Oh, definitely. Sidney Griffith, for instance, argues pretty strongly that what you see reflected in the Quran is really just mainstream Near Eastern Christianity. The Melchites, Jacobites, Nestorians. But Crone directly tackles that view. She argues those mainstream traditions just don't explain some key Quranic features.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting then. The source lists 9 specific Quranic doctrines that Crone says really point to the presence of Jewish Christians in the messenger's locality. Let's go through them. First one. Christ's mission seems aimed specifically at the Israelites.
Yeah, this is striking. The Quran consistently portrays Jesus as a prophet sent specifically to the Banu Israel, the sons of Israel. Not to everyone, not a universal mission at that stage.
How does that compare to mainstream Christian thought at the time?
Well, it's a huge contrast. Mainstream Christianity quickly came to see Jesus' mission as universal, right?
Hmm.
And often there was this narrative that the Jews have rejected him, so the message went to the Gentiles. But the Qur'an has Jesus himself saying, "O sons of Israel, I am God's messenger to you," confirming the Torah. That specific focus, the source calls it unquestionably Jewish Christian. It sounds very much like something the Ebionites would emphasize.
Why it really stands out. And you mentioned Origen earlier, criticizing the Ebionites.
Exactly. He criticized them for claiming Christ came especially to the Israelites according to the flesh. He saw it as limiting Christ's scope. But that's precisely the view reflected in the Qur'an. And the Qur'an even talks about a split within the Israelites, believing and unbelieving Israelites. That fits perfectly with the idea of Jewish Christians seeing themselves as the true believing Israelites, distinct from other Jews who didn't accept Jesus.
Fascinating. Okay, second point. The term Banu Israel in the Quran seems to sometimes include Christians. How does that work?
Yeah, this is quite subtle but important. Early Islamic interpreters like Qatada and al-Abari, they understood it this way. For example, there's a verse in Surah 5 that condemns saying God is Christ. They interpreted that as being addressed to Israelite Christians.
Why?
Because the verse shows Jesus himself rebuking the Israelites for deifying him. Now, that wouldn't make sense to address to contemporary Jews who never deified Jesus, or even mainstream Christians who had a different understanding of his divinity. It points towards a group within the Israelite umbrella who were seen as wrongly elevating Jesus.
So maybe Jewish Christians who were perhaps seen as going too far by others?
Possibly, or perhaps reflecting debates within those communities. And there's another clue. The Qur'an talks about followers of both the Torah and the Gospel being freed from heavy legal burdens. This suggests that the local Christians being addressed probably observed Jewish-style dietary laws and other restrictions. Again, that points strongly to an Israelite Christian context, maybe Ebionitic.
And a term's changing later.
Right. The shift later in the Medinan surahs to using separate terms, Yaqud for Jews and Nara for Christians, might even hint that Nara itself originally referred specifically to these Jewish Christians before it became the general term. It's complex, but suggestive.
Okay, number 3. The relative importance of Moses and Jesus. This feels like a big one.
It is huge. In the Quran, Moses is clearly the dominant prophetic figure. He gets mentioned far more often than Jesus. And crucially, Jesus is presented as confirming the Torah given to Moses.
Not replacing it or fulfilling it in a way that makes it obsolete.
Exactly. That's a fundamental break from mainstream Gentile Christian theology, which saw Jesus as fulfilling and, in many ways, superseding or abrogating the Mosaic law. The Quranic Jesus, confirming the Torah, that aligns perfectly with Jewish Christian views, especially groups like the Ebionites. The source is blunt. Only Jewish Christians fit that description.
Wow. Okay, 4th. Jewish Christian ideas about Jesus' nature, his humanity. The Quran is very firm that Jesus was human, a prophet, not the Son of God.
Yes, a very low Christology, focusing on his humanity. This contrasts sharply with the developing mainstream doctrines about Jesus' divinity, the Trinity, the Incarnation. Now, there were different views even among early Jewish Christians. The source mentions host Christology, the idea of a heavenly being inhabiting the human Jesus. But, and this is key, some Ebionites specifically regarded him as a prophet of the normal humankind. They thought he was filled with God's Spirit, yes, enabling him to prophesy. But he wasn't divine himself. That's a direct parallel to the Quran's stance.
So the source says there was basically no Gentile Christian precedent for saying Jesus was purely human and that this was the actual truth everyone should accept.
Precisely. That insistence on his pure humanity as the core truth is very distinctive, and it points away from the direction mainstream Christianity was heading. And it's interesting, much later in early modern Europe, you had groups like the Socinians who also denied the Trinity. They actually looked back and suggested a historical link between these early Jewish Christians, like the Ebionites and Islam, precisely because of this shared view on Jesus' humanity.
Okay, number 5 is about Mary and the Trinity. The Quran seems to argue against a specific kind of Trinity involving Mary.
Yes, it strongly refutes the idea of God, Jesus, and Mary as a divine triad. There's that striking passage where God asks Jesus, "Did you say to people, adopt me and my mother as two gods apart from God?"
That's very specific.
It is. And the Quran even argues against their divinity by saying both of them ate food, drawing on that ancient idea that divine beings don't need physical sustenance. It helps make sense of another Quranic phrase, God is the third of three, suggesting it refers to this specific polemic against a God-Christ-Mary triad.
Is there a Jewish-Christian parallel for that, for Mary being seen as divine somehow?
There's a really potent one, actually. A Coptic sermon attributed to someone called 𝙅𝙬𝙬𝙬𝙀 quotes from a Gospel of the Hebrews, and describes Mary as a mighty power in the heavens, which was called Michael, the archangel Michael, who then came down into the world and was called Mary.
Whoa! Equating Mary with Michael.
Yeah. It's a direct identification of Mary as a pre-existing heavenly being. This provides a very strong, very specific Jewish-Christian parallel to the kind of belief the Qur'an seems to be arguing against. It suggests such ideas were circulating, perhaps within some Ebionitic or related circles.
Incredible. Okay, sixth point. The crucifixion. The Qur'an says Jesus wasn't actually killed or crucified, it only looked that way. This is called docetism.
Right. Docetism from the Greek doken, to seem. The belief that Christ didn't have a real physical body or only seemed to suffer. The Qur'an explains the crucifixion docetically. The thinking might be, as the source suggests, that the messenger found the idea of God's prophet being killed by his enemies, the Jews in this narrative, just too problematic, too offensive. Docetism offered a way around it.
And the Jewish-Christian connection.
Again, 𝙅𝙬𝙬𝙬𝙬 provides a parallel. He mentions figures who taught a similar docetic view. Jesus wasn't actually crucified. He was saved and taken to heaven, or maybe someone else was substituted on the cross. This is different from, say, Manichaean docetism, which had its own specific ideas. But the core concept that the crucifixion wasn't real has definite Jewish-Christian echoes, perhaps linked to certain Ebionite strands.
Seventh point, the virgin birth. The Qur'an accepts it, but describes it differently.
Yes, it accepts Mary conceived Jesus while a virgin. But the description is God blowing some of his spirit into Mary. The interpretation here is less about impregnation in a biological sense and more like infusing the spirit of life, similar to how Adam was given life from clay.
And the significance of that?
It allows the Qur'an to affirm the virgin birth without linking it to Jesus being divine. Mainstream Christianity increasingly tied the two together. Mary's virginity was proof of Jesus' divine sonship, but the source notes only Jewish Christians could decouple Jesus' virgin birth from his status as the Son of God. They could accept the miracle, but still see Jesus as a human prophet, which fits the Ebionite perspective well.
And the Qur'an also defends Mary's reputation quite strongly.
It does. It emphasizes her chastity, mentions Joseph only as a guardian. This was likely pushing back against anti-Christian polemics, like the Jewish story of Jesus being illegitimate, the son of Panthera. This defense and the implied perpetual virginity echoes texts like the Proto-Evangelium of James, which might itself have Jewish Christian origins aimed at protecting Mary's honor.
Okay, number 8 is really striking. Mary as an Aaronid, sister of Aaron, daughter of Imran.
Yes, this is a big one. Identifying Mary this way connects her to the priestly lineage of Aaron, Moses' brother, making her a Levite.
Why does that matter so much?
Because mainstream Christianity absolutely depends on Jesus being descended from David through Mary, or Joseph, depending on the genealogy, for his claim to be the Messiah, the king. Making Mary an Aaronid, a Levite, completely undermines that Davidic claim. It was definitely a marginal idea in early Christianity.
But it existed somewhere.
It did, particularly in Jewish Christian contexts. You find ideas about an Aaronid or Levitical Messiah in places like the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs. And the Manichaeans, who remember emerged from an Elkossite Jewish Christian background, also denied Mary was Davidic, saying she was from the tribe of Levi. 𝙅𝙬𝙬𝙬𝙬 again confirms this Aaronid lineage for Mary. It's another specific non-mainstream idea pointing towards Jewish Christian sources, maybe Ebionitic.
Amazing. Okay, ninth and final main point, the prophetic chain.
Right. The Qur'an presents this long line of prophets, Adam, Noah, Abraham, Moses, Jesus, ending with Muhammad, all bringing essentially the same core message of monotheism, all part of one continuous chain of revelation.
And this structure has Jewish-Christian parallels, too.
Very much so. The Book of 𝗃𝗀𝗃, from the 2nd century, linked to those Ebionitic culture-site groups, saw all prophets as incarnations of the same pre-existing Christ figure, bringing the same message repeatedly. You also see similar ideas of prophetic succession in the Nestorians' Gospel of the Hebrews and the Pseudo-Clementine homilies, other key Jewish Christian texts. This concept of a repeating pattern, a continuous divine message through linked prophets, is a strong echo.
Wow. That's quite a list of parallels. And the source mentions a couple of other quick ones. Jesus' birth under a palm tree and the meaning of Messiah and word.
Yeah, just briefly. The Qur'an story of Mary giving birth under a palm tree, finding dates and water that's not in the main Gospels. But you do find it in later apocryphal texts like the �libra Echie and Pseudo-Matthew. What's notable is the Qur'an emphasizes Mary's labor pains, which mainstream tradition often downplayed, suggesting a painless, miraculous birth. This more earthly detail, perhaps drawing on these other traditions, might again point to non-mainstream, possibly Jewish Christian sources. And then the titles Al-Messiah, Messiah, and Al-Kalima, the Word. The Quran uses them for Jesus, but completely empties them of their standard Christian theological weight, things like redemptive sacrifice, divine kingship, pre-existence. The Quran seems unaware of or uninterested in those meanings, using the titles differently, often polemically. Again, this fits much better with a Jewish Christian framework, like the Ebionites, who had a different understanding of Jesus' role in nature than with mainstream Christianity.
So, okay, we've gone through these 9 points plus a couple more. When you put it all together, what's the big takeaway from this deep dive?
Well, the cumulative effect is pretty powerful, isn't it? It strongly suggests significant Jewish Christian influence on the Quran. You have this whole cluster of ideas about Jesus and Mary in the Quran that are just, well, non-standard if you look at them from a mainstream Christian viewpoint. Jesus as a prophet only to Israelites, the slack denial of his divine sonship, his book confirming the Torah, the Docetic crucifixion, Mary as an Aaronid, the palm tree birth story.
It's a lot of specific details.
It is. It's just too many specific points, too many echoes of known Jewish Christian beliefs, particularly things associated with groups like the Ebionites, to easily dismiss them as coincidence.
And even if maybe some specific Ebionite groups weren't prominent by the 7th century.
Exactly. These ideas themselves trace back much earlier to the first few centuries of Christianity, before the lines between mainstream and heretical were so sharply drawn. So the source concludes, the most obvious candidates are Jewish Christians. Whatever the exact timing or mechanism, these groups, or at least their distinctive ideas, must in fact have been present in the localities in which the messenger was active, for their unique perspectives to be reflected so clearly in the Quran.
It really paints a picture of a much more complex religious environment than we sometimes imagine.
It absolutely does.
What a fascinating deep dive. It really does open up some new ways of thinking about how the Quran was formed, potentially drawing heavily on these early, often forgotten Jewish Christian traditions, like those of the Ebionites.
It definitely encourages us to look beyond the simpler stories, doesn't it? To appreciate the really rich, tangled, and dynamic interplay of religious ideas in the ancient Near East. History is rarely straightforward.
Well, you've been on a deep dive with us, exploring these surprising echoes of Jewish Christianity within the Quran. Makes you wonder what other connections are waiting to be uncovered. Join us again next time for another deep dive into the heart of knowledge.